You've lost your spark, your direction, your reason, and no matter how much you try to explain it, nothing seems to make sense. But what if this is actually the sign that, for the first time, something real is beginning to happen? You might think you're falling apart, but what's really happening is something else. You're shedding everything that was never truly you. This is a very common phase after a spiritual awakening, a moment when the ego starts to lose its grip, and with it go many of the motivations that once felt essential, but were really driven by fear, the need for approval, the pressure to uphold an image. It's the beginning of something deeper trying to come through. Carl Jung believed this crossing was essential. It's the point where the surface self must step aside to make room for the self, the most authentic center of our psyche. For Jung, this stage demands a breakdown of the old identity, a process where the socially constructed self unravels so the soul can begin to reorganize itself from the inside out. That's why, in this video, I'm going to clearly explain what this phase is all about. Why your motivation disappeared after your spiritual awakening, and most importantly, what you can actually do with that. How to move through this moment without losing yourself. Stick with me until the end. This might change how you understand what you're going through, and give you real tools to walk your path with more awareness. And if this kind of content resonates with you, make sure to subscribe. Here, we talk about real inner processes. No empty promises, no cookie-cutter formulas, just what truly helps. And if this is the kind of space you've been needing, welcome. Most people, after a spiritual awakening, expect peace, clarity, purpose. But what they often find is paralysis. Motivation vanishes, like it's been pulled out by the roots. What used to excite you doesn't move you anymore. Plans lose their glow, and a strange feeling settles in, like you're stuck between two worlds. Jung understood this well. He observed that when the ego starts losing its central role, the psyche enters a liminal state, like a space between what no longer is and what hasn't yet been born. This in-between often shows up as emptiness. But it's not just any emptiness. It's the psychic space left behind when illusions begin to collapse. The motivation you lost was actually propped up by structures that are now falling apart. Goals built on outside expectations. Desires shaped to please, to win, to play roles. When those foundations crumble, there's no energy left. Because there's no character left to drive the story forward. And this is the moment the soul starts to breathe for the first time. But this breath is subtle, slow, almost imperceptible. Jung called this the process of individuation, a deep journey where the surface self gives way to the self, that quieter, more integrated center within. And for the self to emerge, the ego first needs to dissolve. In this context, the absence of motivation isn't failure. It's transition. It's the pause where performance ends, and the real being begins to reorganize itself from within. Unhurried, unseen. But how exactly does that happen? The loss of motivation that comes after awakening doesn't start with a bang. It begins with silence. A specific kind of silence. Heavy, strange, disorienting. Like the whole world kept spinning outside, and you stayed behind in a place where even time feels suspended. This isn't ordinary apathy. It's not laziness. It's as if every answer dissolved, and along with them, the need to keep searching. You look around, and there's no urgency, no direction. Just a thick emptiness settling where once there was drive. Jung called this phase the nigredo, the first stage in the alchemical process of psychic transformation. A moment of total darkness, where the old structure begins to disintegrate, but the new one hasn't yet arrived. Nothing grows here, not yet. But nothing is wasted either. The silence that frightens you is the same one that prepares you. This stage slowly erodes what once felt solid. Interests fade, desires lose their meaning, routine feels hollow. It's a kind of internal exile, where you no longer know who you are, but also can't pretend to be who you were. At this stage, the soul doesn't want solutions, it wants space. And what feels like paralysis is actually a deep recalibration. The old system of being is being dismantled piece by piece. What once felt like performance now feels absurd. What was once habit now sounds like noise. Everything feels out of place. That's when many people panic and try to retreat to the comfort of what they used to know. But what they knew no longer works. That's why this absence, as scary as it is necessary. It's the womb of your next self. But as this inner space expands, something else begins to give. The old desire to go, to do, to prove, begins to collapse. Because the foundation that fueled all of that has crumbled. What once moved you no longer finds ground to stand on. This is when motivation starts to feel like a ghost. You remember having goals, ideas, plans. You remember the thrill of chasing something. But now, it all feels distant, like it belonged to someone else. And in a way, it did. That drive came from a place that no longer exists. From an ego trained to survive on approval, achievement, comparison. Now that ego is fragmenting, and the fuel that powered it is running dry, this lack of motivation isn't a failure. It's a symptom. A symptom that your old center of gravity has dissolved, and the new one hasn't yet taken form. The soul doesn't respond to external pressure. It doesn't organize itself around goals. What it wants is much harder to name. And because we can't name it, many panic. They try to force a return to their old rhythm. They repeat old rituals hoping to reignite what they once felt. But nothing comes back the same. Because something crucial is no longer available. The illusion that you could keep moving forward without first looking inward. What feels like emptiness is actually an internal message. Nothing you do now will feel true if it's just repetition. The soul is making space. And that space, as uncomfortable as it is what allows something more honest to be born. With the collapse of the ego, you begin to realize that many of the things that used to motivate you never really made sense on their own. They made sense because they supported an image. It wasn't you who wanted those things. It was the persona. In Jungian psychology, the persona is the character we learn to play to adapt to the world. It's the identity we create to be accepted, recognized, valued. It's not fake, but it's limited. It served a purpose, but it's not the whole of who you are. And when that character starts to dissolve, the motivation tied to it fades too. The drive to meet goals, earn respect, maintain a certain look, it all loses force. Not because you've stopped caring about life, but because the reason behind those goals was never about life itself. It was about survival. This is a critical point. You're not just unmotivated. You're unplugging from autopilot, that mode that pushes forward without meaning. And when that machine stops, it can feel like everything is falling apart. It's hard to admit that many of our ambitions were inherited, that we grew up trying to fit into expectations that weren't even ours. And now, as the soul starts asking for something more real, those old goals simply don't fit anymore. It can feel like failure, like being lost. But really, you're just without a script. And that's necessary. Because as long as you keep trying to live as the you others expect to see, your true self won't have room to show up. The breakdown of the persona clears the path for something new, something more aligned with who you really are. But that new doesn't have a clear shape yet. That's why the emptiness. You've stopped being who others wanted, and haven't yet discovered who you want to be. That's the point. You haven't lost motivation. You've lost the role that used to sustain it. And now, you're standing at the edge of a real chance to start acting from something more true. When the mind starts collapsing, the body notices first. Even before you fully understand what's happening emotionally, your body is already reacting. And those reactions aren't random. They're communication. Jung believed the unconscious doesn't just live in thoughts. It speaks through the body. When certain psychic contents can't be processed by consciousness, they find another route. Through the body, the unconscious speaks where the mind stays silent. That's why, during this phase, so many people report extreme fatigue, low energy, unexplained aches. The internal system is being reconfigured, and the body, which once ran on the tempo of persona and performance, begins to slow down, by force. The old self ran on effort. Wake up early, produce, respond, perform. Now that mode is dissolving. The body shuts down the old signals. It stops responding to goals that no longer matter, and starts demanding rest, presence, stillness. The apathy, the slowness, the heightened sensitivity. They can look like signs of burnout or even illness. But in many cases, it's just the soul asking for space. The body reacts because it's part of the process. It feels when something is slipping from ego control into another kind of guidance. This kind of transition can't be forced. Pushing your body to keep up the old rhythm only deepens the disconnect. The path now isn't about forcing action. It's about noticing what's rising behind what looks like stillness. Fatigue isn't weakness. It's built-up resistance. It's years of tension your body held just to keep an emotional structure upright. Now that this structure is collapsing, the body lets go, not as a breakdown, but as a release. And it's in this state that you begin to realize just how disconnected you were, how much the body was carrying, not just physical weight, but adaptation, fear, pressure. All of it left marks. And now, those marks are rising to the surface. Your body isn't working against you. It's trying to show you something your mind might not yet understand. And that something needs to be heard. With the persona falling apart and the body sending signals, the unconscious finds cracks through which it can emerge. And what rises to the surface now isn't lightness, it's shadow. The anger you always suppressed. The fear you covered with forced courage. The sadness you buried under productivity. All the things you pushed aside now begin to take center stage. Jung called the shadow everything the ego rejects. These are the denied aspects of your personality. The traits you were taught to hide. The emotions that were censored. The impulses that didn't fit the role you had to play. But the shadow doesn't vanish just because it's repressed. It waits. And when the ego loses power, the shadow enters. Not for revenge, but out of necessity. The psyche seeks integration. It wants to function as a whole. And that's only possible if what's been denied is finally acknowledged. That's why so many people feel emotionally overwhelmed during this phase. Sudden tears, random irritation, old sensations crashing back in. Sometimes there's shame, sometimes guilt. These are pieces of you returning home. The ego will resist. It will say this is weakness, that you're regressing, that you've lost control. But you haven't. You've just stopped controlling things with the force you used to. And that makes room for a more honest listening to what's alive inside. This meeting with the shadow is uncomfortable because it demands courage to look at what's been hidden. But it's also one of the most important steps in the journey, because this is where you stop idealizing yourself and start recognizing yourself. With light and flaws, with power and limits, whole. Jung said, the shadow is 90% gold. In other words, within what you reject lie essential resources. Creativity, strength, instinct, sensitivity. But they only become available when you stop fighting what you feel and start listening to it. You're not getting worse, you're getting in touch. And that changes everything. Once the shadow shows itself, what's left is a strange space. Neither empty nor full. An interval where the urge to please is gone, but the drive to act hasn't yet arrived. The ego, disoriented, stops commanding. But the self hasn't fully stepped in. And that's when silence changes meaning. It stops being absence and starts becoming awareness. Jung described the self as the organizing center of the psyche. Not the idealized ego, but the wholeness that includes all parts. Conscious, unconscious, light, and dark. This center is in no rush. It doesn't show up with flair. It doesn't need to prove anything. It waits for the ego to step aside, not to be replaced, but to be repositioned. The drive to do, to achieve, to be seen. That was the ego's. The self wants something else, something closer to internal coherence. The new motivation that starts to emerge here isn't born of ambition or lack. It grows from the desire to be who you are, even if that never wins applause. The philosopher Simone Weil once wrote, "Pure attention is the rarest and most generous form of love." In this phase, that attention begins to turn inward. Maybe for the first time you start to see yourself through eyes that don't judge, don't compare, don't demand results. And that, in itself, is a revolution. The self doesn't arrive with a clear image. It reveals itself in small gestures. Choosing rest instead of pushing through. Saying what you really think. Turning down something you would have forced yourself into before. There's no spectacle. Just consistency. Here, the soul begins to guide. But it doesn't shout. It leads in silence. And that requires you to completely shift how you relate to your own desires. What once felt urgent now sounds like noise. And what once seemed insignificant now carries real weight. You still don't know exactly who's emerging, but you can feel that you're no longer who you tried to be. The performance has lost its meaning. Movement now comes from somewhere else. A place that doesn't care about impressing, only about staying true. Even when the self begins to send signals, the mind, still shaped by linear time, tries to rush. Anxiety creeps in. A desire to quickly define who you are, what to do, where this is all going. But the soul doesn't work by that clock. It moves to another rhythm. In Greek mythology, Chronos is clock time. Hours, deadlines, schedules. But Kairos is sacred time, the right moment that can't be rushed or planned. It's the time of quiet ripening, of the sprout breaking through the soil without announcement. Depth psychology recognizes this. James Hillman, a leading post-Jungian thinker, wrote that the soul has an affinity for slowness. He spoke of honoring the psychic time, the kind that feels inefficient but brings real transformation. In this phase, rushing is counterproductive. It becomes another form of denial. The ego wants to fix it now. The soul wants to mature. While you try to get back to being productive, the soul is reorganizing your entire internal reference system. And that doesn't happen over a weekend. Sometimes not even in a few months. It's common to feel guilty for not producing, to compare yourself with people who seem to be moving faster. But the soul doesn't measure progress by outer standards. It's not aiming for performance. It's trying to grow roots, and that takes time in the dark, without guarantees of quick results. This waiting is uncomfortable because there's no manual. You can't map out the next steps clearly. What exists is a kind of inner listening that gets more refined with time. A trust built not on promises, but on presence. The more you try to accelerate, the more tangled it gets. But when you start accepting the soul's pace, something clicks. Life stops being a checklist and starts becoming a field of signals. And you realize you're being guided, even when you don't understand where it's going. You're not behind. You're on a different timeline, and that timeline deserves to be honored. As external time loses its grip, a new logic begins to take shape within. You're no longer chasing results. You're seeking meaning. And when that shift happens, the motivation that once felt lost begins to return, but with a new nature. It no longer shows up as pressure or demand. It comes as a response to something inside that's finally been given space to speak. This new motivation doesn't sparkle with ambition, but it carries a different kind of strength. Steadiness. The soul doesn't want speed. It wants direction. And when the self begins to settle as your axis, your choices start following a new compass. Not based on what looks right to others, but on what feels right from the inside out. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, once wrote, "Man's search is not for pleasure or power, but for meaning. And when he finds that meaning, even in suffering, a resilient motivation is born, one that doesn't depend on circumstances." At this point, the urgency that used to steer your days loses its grip. You're no longer moved by anxiety. You begin to act with more awareness, even if from the outside, it looks like you're doing less. Your doing becomes a reflection of your inner state, not an attempt to cover it up. The peace that emerges here isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of coherence. You feel aligned with something more essential, and even when doubt returns, it doesn't unravel you like before. Because now, what leads you isn't an external answer. It's a quiet clarity born from having walked through everything that once threatened to break you. This new motivation feels lighter, but it's also stronger. It doesn't force itself, but it doesn't retreat either. It holds steady because it has roots. And roots are what start to grow when you stop trying to outrun yourself and finally choose to stay. What you've been through isn't just a psychological process. It's an archetypal journey, a pattern that shows up in every mythology, every religion, every story of deep transformation. Every soul that awakens must first disappear from itself. Only then can it begin to return. Joseph Campbell called this the monomyth, the hero's journey, a cycle repeated from ancient myths to modern narratives. The hero receives a call, crosses a desert, faces shadows, and only then finds something that changes them. This isn't just literary metaphor, it's an accurate map of the psyche. Jung saw myths as reflections of inner processes. Christ in the wilderness, Moses in exile, Odysseus wandering aimlessly. All of them represent the same moment you may be living, the passage through nothingness. This phase, where everything feels suspended, meaningless, futureless, isn't the end of the story. It's the preparation for return, but not a return to what was. A return transformed, with new eyes, a new center, a different presence. What mythology makes clear, and depth psychology confirms, is that this space between collapse and rebuilding serves a purpose. It empties to make room. It erodes what's false to allow what's real to emerge. It breaks the form to reveal the essence. But unlike myths, real life has no soundtrack. No dramatic revelations, no clear finale. What you get are almost invisible moments, when you realize you're no longer reacting the way you used to. Certain pains have lost their grip. Your inner voice sounds clearer. Something in you just knows what to do, even if it can't say why. This is sacred fire. Not the bright spark of shallow enthusiasm, but the steady flame burning low and deep in your chest. It doesn't burn outward, it warms from within. And that's what starts guiding your steps from here on. So far, we've talked about what happens when motivation disappears. The fall of the ego, the breakdown of the persona, the arrival of the shadow, changes in the body, and the deep inner silence. All of it is part of a real profound process. But understanding is only half the journey. Moving through it is the other. That's why now is the time to bring the body back, to bring the everyday back, but in a way that honors the soul's pace. What follows isn't a list of magic fixes. These are ways to support yourself through this phase with more presence. Simple practices to help you stay centered in the middle of the passage. First practice. Write what you feel, unfiltered. Every day for 10 minutes, write exactly how you're feeling. It doesn't have to make sense. It can be messy, repetitive, without structure. Just let it out. What you don't express builds up. And when you write, even without understanding, you begin to shift internally. Second practice. Name what's alive inside. When the heaviness hits, when motivation disappears, say it out loud. I'm feeling lost today. I'm exhausted. I don't know what to do. Naming your emotions takes the pressure off the silence. It helps your body realize it's not in danger. It's just feeling. Third practice. Walk in silence. No headphones, no music, no distractions. Just walk. Hear your footsteps. Feel your breath. Let your body reset at its own pace. The soul listens better when the body moves slowly. Fourth practice. Do less, but with more presence. Pick one thing to do each day. Just one, and give it your full attention. Cook a meal. Clean a small corner of your home. Respond to one message calmly. This pulls you out of pressure and brings you back to center. It's not about how much you do. It's about how deeply you connect. Fifth practice. Create a small symbolic altar. It doesn't have to be religious. Just a corner with objects that reflect what you're going through. A stone, a candle, a word on paper. These symbols remind you that the invisible matters too. That you're in a process with value, even if you can't yet explain it. Sixth practice. Carve out time just for you. Truly. Pick a moment each day, or week, where nothing is required of you. A pocket of stillness, of pause, of not doing. This is where the soul breathes, where the self can show up without being forced. You don't need to follow all of these practices exactly. Choose what resonates. What matters is remembering. Getting through this phase requires gentleness, not speed, not pressure, just space and presence. And only you can give yourself that space. If you've made it this far, you've probably realized the absence of motivation isn't the end of anything. It's the beginning of something deeper. It's not a sign of failure. It's a sign that something in you has grown tired of pretending. This forced pause that makes you feel cut off from the world is actually reconnecting you to the most authentic part of your existence. The part that doesn't perform, that doesn't seek validation, that doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. What dies in this process isn't you. It's the illusion of who you thought you had to be. What is born in time is something more honest. A quieter identity, but one with more integrity. Less polished, but more alive. Jung said we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And maybe that's exactly where you are now. Not in freefall, in revelation. Not stuck, in reconstruction. Not lost, just unhurried. So if nothing makes much sense right now, if the world feels far away and you can't move like you used to, breathe. Don't push. Don't run. Stay. The presence you hold today is the ground where your true self will learn to walk. You're not standing still. You're taking shape, and that takes time. But it's worth every second. And now I ask you to comment below, I have awakened. That phrase isn't just a symbol. It's a quiet commitment to the process you're living through. And it's also a way to show that you're not alone. If this video helped you in any way, and you feel moved to give back, consider clicking the thanks button. That support allows this kind of content to keep reaching farther, with more depth and consistency. Every bit of support makes a real difference, and helps keep this space alive for those who need to hear these words. Thank you for being here, truly. See you in the next video.